Hello and welcome to the IMD Podcast Network. Today we're bringing you the second episode of our sustainability series with IMD professors Julia Binder and Knut Haanes. They're speaking with Kunal Chandra, the Director of Strategy and Sustainability at RWE in Essen.
Hello, I'm Julia Binder.
And I'm Knut Haanes.
And this is Inside the Transition, the IMD podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at the energy transition and what it means for executives and their business.
In this episode, we're looking at the speed of this transition and the challenges it creates. Renewables are scaling at record speed, demand is rising from industry, transport, and now AI, and utilities are under pressure to secure an entirely new system while keeping the lights on.
Few companies are as central to that transformation as RWE, and few people have a better vantage point on what's coming next than our guest today. Kunal Chandra is RWE's Head of Strategy and Chief Sustainability Officer, and an IMD alumni as well. He oversees one of Europe's largest clean energy investment programs and helps steer the company through one of the most ambitious transformations in the power sector.
Today, we're going to talk about how quickly the energy transition is taking place in Europe, what technologies matter the most, how investment patterns are shifting, and, of course, what business leaders should expect in the next 3 to 5 years.
Europe's energy system is changing faster than at any point in modern history. But is it moving fast enough? Where are the biggest bottlenecks? And which strategic choices will define success in a more electrified and more contested energy world?
Kunal, welcome to Inside the Transition. It's great to have you with us.
Kunal, let's start with your own story because it's a really fascinating one. You've moved through Shell, Siemens, and now RWE. It almost feels as if you've been surfing the waves of the energy transition before most of us even noticed that the tide is turning. What first pulled you into this space? And was there a moment when something clicked, or was it more of a gradual realization that this is where the future is heading?
I grew up in India and I studied engineering from one of the top universities in India, the Indian Institute of Technology. And I remember telling my friends when they asked me what kind of career or job do I want to start with. And I said, look, the only thing I care about right now is going abroad, because I was 21. I had a graduate degree from a top-notch college in India, but I had never set foot outside India. And at that point, Shell wanted to recruit some engineers for their technology center in Bangalore, which was, of course, not fitting my aspiration of going abroad. But they said it came with a 4-month training program in Netherlands. And that, for me, was good enough to sign up for a job at Shell. And that's how the journey started in the beginning. But of course, as I spent more time with Shell and pursued a career in that company, which took me to different countries like Singapore, like Nigeria, Netherlands, India, I realized how fundamental energy is to the human civilization. And the history of human civilization can almost be traced parallelly to the history of the energy systems that we could use to power that civilization. So at some point, what started off as a desire to rendezvous around the world turned into a serious interest in energy, which of course led to interest in geopolitics and all the other things that come with it. And after 9 or 10 years at Shell, around the world in different parts of the business, I thought there was a need for me to sort of, learn more about the financial side of things, but also about leadership, because I started to realize that the energy business was also a lot about the belief of the leaders who are in that industry. You can change the tide of this business based on the things that you believe in, right? For example, does equality matter? Do you want to price the planet in? Things like that, right? And that's what got me to IMD, which at that time was also a great partner with Shell in developing their future leaders. But once I was at IMD, of course, as it happens, once you gain more knowledge, it becomes hard to ignore things that earlier you were not aware of. And I spent a lot of time at IMD also then understanding about the renewable business, the energy transition, what was happening. I was out of the echo chamber of a certain kind of a company that, of course, benefited from a different business model, which made me then think, what is the future of energy, not as we see from a vantage point of an individual company, but from a different vantage points. Could be investors, could be capital markets, but could also be society in general. And then that sort of propelled me to move to Siemens, because I thought that a lot of the energy transition was suffering because there was not sufficient technology out there. And therefore, the answer must lie in first updating the technology before you can go to companies like Shell and Exxon and ask them to invest in those technologies. And that pursuit took me to Siemens, where I spent some time developing a hydrogen business, developing their decentral electricity business, developing, of course, the turbines that could run on not just natural gas, but again, hydrogen, etc. And from, and spending some time there, I also started to realize that transition was happening the fastest in the electricity sector, because what I call the green premium, which is basically the cost difference between using a green alternative versus a fossil alternative, was narrowing quite rapidly in the electricity sector. And that's when I realized that if I want to spend the limited amount of time I have in my life and career making an impact on the transition, perhaps moving to a utility might not be a bad idea. That's how I ended up at RWE, where at the moment we are running, as you said, Julia, one of the most ambitious investment programs in Europe, but also in the world, investing anywhere between 5 and 7 billion per year into renewable technologies, which is almost 95% of our total investment portfolio. And we can talk more about the details of the portfolio.
Super. Thank you, Kunal. And if you were sitting beautiful summer day next summer and you were going to explain to a friend who doesn't know the industry, who doesn't really know the changes, what is taking place in Europe and what are we seeing right now?
First of all, maybe just start with the big numbers. What are we solving for? We are solving for a planet where the CO2 levels remain within the limits of the tolerance of the planet, right? So that's really what we are solving for. We have a perfectly good energy system, which was developed over the last 150 years, based mainly on fossil fuels, first on coal and then on oil, until we hit a constraint that we realized that we don't have infinite budget of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? So, but we did develop, and I have to give a lot of credit to the industry that came before the renewable industry. We did develop a very efficient economic energy system. And what that allowed us to do was it allowed us to move the energy quite easily between different parts of the world, which is what we call the global commodity markets in oil and gas. It allowed us to have very high energy density, which meant that we could invest in industrial processes that were far away from energy sources, but because we could store very high levels of energy density, we were able to power those industrial processes, for example, refining, other industrial processes, etc. But of course, the CO2 created a bit of a challenge for the industry. And therefore, if we would have continued on the path where we were in the 90s, early 90s, or even late 90s, early 2000, today we would have been on a path of around 4.5 degrees Celsius, which means that the CO2 concentration would go on in the atmosphere, that it would increase the average temperature of the planet by 4.5 degrees. Now, after all the money that has been spent, and people have different opinion about how efficient it was, the planet is right now somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 degrees Celsius, depending on how you sort of count it. But that already is quite significant. And if you look only at Europe, the CO2 intensity of the GDP has gone down quite substantially. Let me not miss the point that we are transforming not an existing system, but a growing system. Because in India, in China, in Africa, there's still a lot of new energy demand, which is coupled with their GDP growth. So when I'm talking about the planet being on 3.5 degree instead of a 4.5 degree, this is in spite of all the growth that has sort of come in the world, right? So overall, there is a lot of good news that the energy transition is delivering, and the energy transition is sort of moving the arc of the planet in the right direction. I can give some numbers, but these are probably well known to your listeners. In Germany alone, we have around 30 to 40% of electricity demand coming from renewables. And a lot of this is in the money. What do I mean? That yes, some of this is subsidized by the government, but there is a lot of renewable energy built into the merchant markets, which means they simply take the price of electricity as it is being traded. So a lot of this is sort of in the money. There's a lot of focus now also on the scope 3 carbon emissions. So you could also argue that Europe has outsourced a lot of its industrial manufacturing, and therefore, of course, the footprint is going down. But there are numbers to show there that the total consumed CO2, which means not only of the products that are produced here, but also the products that are imported, even that number is substantially reducing. That's about the electricity sector and the power sector. And as I said, it's largely driven by the cost out in the photovoltaic business, which again has been a very long leading cost curve. But in the last 10 or 15 years, the cost out in the photovoltaic PV modules has been quite significant, which has driven a lot of this transition. Today, it's totally insane to think of building a new coal plant if you could also build a photovoltaic plant, yeah, because the costs are just so different and so competitive for the solar module. In the wind business, on the onshore side, you saw similar trends. However, there were other challenges around supply chain, around inflation, etc., which has made the cost of the wind projects not reduce as substantially as they were in the, let's say, in the last 10 years. But that's also a short-term challenge where the supply chains just have to catch up with the growth that we want to bring about. And so overall, I would say that the electricity sector is decarbonizing very fast. Economically, there are some bits and pieces of missing money here and there, but that's not a big challenge. The issue now stands with the grids because the renewables are volatile by nature, and therefore you need to have a slightly different grid mechanism. You need much more grid capacity when the renewables are at peak. Compared to when you had the different system of nuclear gas, etc. So the grid investments have to take place. But again, there is substantial investments already planned, earmarked, or under construction. And therefore, in the next few years, you would see that the transition continues as it has in the past. Now we are talking about the downstream sectors, which are comprising about 40 to 50% of all the emissions. These would be, for example, in Germany or Europe, this would be heat. This would also include transport, some industries, etc. And there we, of course, see that depending on which industry or sector you talk about, there is different levels of green premium. So one of the most difficult things to decarbonize are certain parts of industry, like a cement industry, right? Because cement is a very low price commodity that is used very widely, and it produces a lot of CO2 for a single dollar of value. And so if you now try to decarbonize it, the price of cement becomes so expensive that it would become unaffordable at the volumes at which it is traded around the world, right? And for good reason. And these are still the areas where we need to find a solution. On the transport side, there are two parts. One is on the electricity, one is on the electric passenger cars. That is also decarbonizing well and in line with the power sector itself. And I see that with some hiccups, sooner or later, we will get to a point where a large fleet of the electric cars, or of the cars in Germany and Europe, will be electric. Then there are this long distance trailers, trucks, barges. This is where you still see some challenge. The technology has developed, so you have e-fuels in the mix, you have SAF, for example, for aviation, but there's still substantial amount of green premium that needs to be brought down. So in summary, I would say electricity getting there almost on its own feet, technology ready for most of the sectors, and then green premium to be addressed for certain parts of the downstream sectors.
Kunal, this was already extremely rich, and I think we want to deep dive a little bit more. You mentioned the importance of, let's say, investments, grid stability. You've mentioned also that the importance of a green premium for kind of really financing this decarbonization. One of the topics that I haven't heard you touch upon yet is AI, which we hear a lot and which currently has arrived with a giant energy appetite of its own. And my question would be, and if so, how can the system keep up with all that demand you've mentioned, right? So we have all of this decarbonization, which in reality means electrifying almost everything from cars, as you mentioned, to homes or factories. Now AI enters the game. How is that changing the equation?
AI has fundamentally changed the electricity industry as we know it in the Western world. So the Western world, when I say I mean Europe and the US, we had never known fundamental energy growth for the last many, many years. And why? not because there was no GDP growth. There was definitely GDP growth in this part of the world, but the energy systems were becoming very efficient. So therefore, the amount of energy you required for a unit of GDP was just reducing, and for all the other things that I explained. And the more you electrify, the more energy efficient you become. Because if you look at your car, and if you put 1 unit of liquid fuel into your car, you only get about 35% of that out as energy. But when you put 1 unit of electricity in your car, you almost get 99% of it as mobility energy, right? So all of those reasons meant that we were becoming much more efficient with energy. And the only growth we were seeing in Europe and US was what is called transition growth, which, Knut, as you mentioned, we were retrofitting an existing system. What AI has done for the very first time is just completely raise the bar on fundamental energy growth. And therefore, energy transition truly becomes an energy addition right now. And so if you look at US, and in spite of what people could argue as a slightly adverse stand of the administration against renewables, you don't really see a slowdown in the renewable build out in the US, right? Because all of that energy is needed to power data center, to power the AI revolution. At the same time, you see that the gas build out and the discussions of the gas build out are almost at the peak levels of 2002, 2003, when gas was really taking over from coal, right? So gas is sort of back in the system again at the same level. So AI is definitely going to require a lot of energy, and it is probably the only bottleneck right now, because it feels like the compute bottleneck can be solved. The chips, the compute, that is not such a big bottleneck anymore. And this also means that in the short term, AI will have to be powered by gas. And that's where you also see in the valuations of all the companies that are involved in the gas value chain, whether it be utilities or whether it be equipment manufacturers. If you go to my previous employer right now and ask them to give me a gas turbine, they would probably be very nice and polite and put you on a wait list, which is 5 to 7 years long. Yeah, so that's indeed a challenge. At the same time, where I see the advantages is that so far we were doing an energy transition, which was a cost on the society. And therefore, for example, when we were talking about the green premium, we didn't find any way that the markets could handle that green premium. But today, when you think that, okay, the AI is going to benefit and create so much wealth, perhaps they could help develop certain technologies out there which so far were not in the money, right? Because they are willing to pay more premium and they can then benefit downstream. And again, as I said, the renewable technologies are generally faster to market compared to the fossil technologies. So it remains to be seen. But I think what would happen is that AI would accelerate everything. It would accelerate energy demand. It would accelerate transition. At the same time, we need to find a solution then what happens to all the gas that is coming into the market. Having said that, the gas can be decarbonized using CCS or using even hydrogen. And therefore, I think if we focus in the right areas, ultimately what could happen is that AI not only leads to a lot of energy demand, but also a faster energy transition.
If you look further ahead, so AI drives demand, and of course we can figure out ways to kind of meet that demand with the current. But do you see any medium, longer term game changers in terms of new technologies, new ways of creating energy?
Look, I mean, energy industry has a lot of data and track record that you can go back and look into. And to get energy from a pilot lab scale experiment to a commercial level, it has almost always taken a good 30, 40 years to sort of go through that development cycle. Photovoltaic, people are always saying this completely transformed the world in the last decade or so. But if you look at when they were actually invented, it was the late 60s, early 70s, and it was invented by an oil company, and they just could not find a way to increase the energy density of that module. And it was sold to a Japanese company to then build calculators and watches, which some of us might have owned those as well. But then it took another 50 years for it to get to the point where it did get to. Ultimately, the cost out was significant, but this kind of a cost out we have only seen twice in the history of all the products out there. One was photovoltaic cells, and the other was in microprocessors, where again, and the memories, the computer memories. And what is common between these technologies is that they're all semiconductor based technologies. And the semiconductor based technologies generally have a nonlinear exponential or a reverse exponential cost out curve. But most of the other technologies which we use in the energy industry, they follow sort of classical physics, and therefore the cost outs are also quite linear, whether it's wind, whether it's hydrogen, etc. So, having said that, it's hard to find a technology which we don't already know about today, which could be deployed at scale in the next decades. Nuclear is, of course, one where you could argue that we know that technology for a long time, and therefore it has done its time in terms of incubating itself. And now maybe something could kickstart that revolution. And therefore, note on that list, I would definitely put nuclear fission, SMR. I am personally hesitant to put nuclear fusion on that list because I think nuclear fusion still has a long way to go, and these are not commercial and economic, but just technical. A long way to go before that technology can be at scale in our system. So the only wild card I would see on the generation side would be nuclear fission, SMR. And then, of course, there's this whole thing that Julia mentioned in the beginning is about storage. Because all the renewable technologies that we are developing today, they are volatile. And therefore, yes, at peak, they deliver the gigawatts that we are looking for, but they have a lot of downtime because the sun is only shining 25%. And so there's a lot of technologies incubating in the storage space, whether they are thermal storage, whether they are molten salt, and all the other sort of technologies, which have to kick in at some point. But they are being incubated right now. So I wouldn't say that they would surprise those who know about the industry. And once you get these sort of long duration storage systems, which can, provide storage for up to 96 to 120 hours, then you will see that this would once again accelerate the deployment of the renewable technologies and make the whole system much more affordable.
Kunal, let me build on what Knut just asked. He asked mostly about technologies that maybe are game changers on our path towards decarbonization. What about tech that we may get wrong? Is there some technologies that you see where the public talks about as if they potentially help us? They're like a silver bullet, which we often hear like in the tech world. Is there any technology that comes to mind where you feel it's completely overrated and it may actually, in the end, slow us down?
I think it depends on what we mean by getting a technology wrong, right? Because of course, economically, you could argue that some technologies will always remain more expensive, but that is always dependent on the extent of decarbonization ambition that we want to shoot for. So again, I started by saying that the world is on a 3.5 degree path or lower, but that still means that we are emitting today about 45 gigatons of CO2. And you can just place that CO2 on a merit order, and you can say almost half of that you can get rid of if you simply switch everything that is running on coal today to gas. Whether in India, whether in China, most of the Asian countries, partly in the US as well, and very few places in Europe now. But half of that is can be switched like that, and therefore the cost of that switch may not be entirely in the money, but the green premium is limited. And as you work your way through this sort of 45 gigatons, you get to this last 4 or 5%, which is what we call ultra deep decarbonization, where, as I said, you might want to take out all the CO2 from cement production. You might want to take out everything from steel production, long distance sea haul. And there you will always find that there will be no technology in the money per se. But that would have to be an ambition of the society to say, we don't care, we just regulate that you have to decarbonize that. And then things like hydrogen would come back into picture, or parts of the liquid fuels will come back into the picture, because there is just no way to decarbonize. So you can't fly an electric plane. You just will never get to a range of a battery which will fly a plane fully electric. you could do that, but then you'll have no space for passengers and the baggage, yeah, because the batteries will take up all the weight just flying themselves. So I think that's what some people are sort of shooting for, certain technologies which might be decarbonizing this sort of real back end of the curve. And that's where we get into this original discussion, whether that's good for the society, whether that's where the government should invest now, whether that's something that could wait a bit longer. And I'm not in a position to sort of prioritize that. But you are right. There are certain technologies which can and should be deprioritized right now because there's a bigger bang for the buck if you focus on other areas.
Super. And let me give you a little bit of a challenge here. You meet a group of CEOs from different industries. They're not in the energy producing industries, they're in consumer goods, they're in different industries. And they ask you, okay, all of this is happening. It's happening in Europe, it's happening around the world. What should we do to prepare for this transition? I mean, it's taking place, but what about me as a taker of energy? What should I do as an executive, as a corporate leader from, well, let's say we're from different industries.
I think, first of all, and that's not just true for transition, and we haven't talked about the other two aspects of sustainability, which hopefully we'll touch on towards the end. What CO2 problem has taught us is that we were continuing to build a society which was economically very efficient, etc., while we were not fully pricing in all the externalities of the planet, right? And this was probably the first time. I mean, we had these kind of cases before with sulfur being used, but those had immediate impact on humans, and we solved those problems rather quickly because the impact of that was seen in a short term, whether it was the ozone layer problem, if you remember, or sulfur, etc.
Acid rain, or
Exactly, the acid rain. But I think what CO2 taught us was that we were able to create an intergenerational issue where all the profits were accrued up front and all the problems were accrued in the future. And this sort of created a perverse incentive for industries and business leaders to just continue with their business as usual without fully pricing in the planet. And the question to all these leaders is, figure out what externalities you are using right now, which you are not paying for. And don't hide behind, oh, it's legal, because a lot of stuff has been legal in the past, which when we look at now from a lens of present, we would be appalled by what was legal 40, 50, 60 years ago without going through the list, right? And so I think if you're a responsible business leader, if you're building a corporation for the next 100 years, and I have had the chance to only work for corporations that are 100 years and old, so I can tell you 100 years go fast. And you want to be proud of creating an organization like that. So the first thing is understand what externalities are in your business. They could be related to energy transition, CO2, but there could be other externalities, for example, around materials, around plastics, well-known biodiversity. People are now using parts of the planet where the species are being affected, but there is really no framework to deal with that. And so they go on with their business as usual. So that would be my advice, to really think through what are the externalities that you haven't paid for yet.
And Kunal, you just mentioned sustainability is not just about the environment, it's also about social factors. And oftentimes this is the tricky part, right? So how do we go fast enough so that it's fast enough for the climate, but not so fast that communities feel run over or people feel left behind? I'm thinking, for example, of the Yellow Vest protests in France and others. How do you navigate that in practice? Because I believe that is also very much a core of the challenge that you're facing in this transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't even have to look at the French example in order to feel that, because in my own company, we are coming from a coal background and transitioning, right? So one of my key priorities is what we call the just transition. And this is something you have to just accept, that the pace of the transition within a portfolio, within a country, within a city would also be dictated by how incumbent is the existing system or the existing status that you are trying to change. For example, where I am right now is called the Rhinish Lignite area, where for almost over a century, coal mining and steel and iron mining has been the heart of the economy here. And we have to take care of that in terms of course, technology and planet, but also in terms of people. And different problems will lead to different solutions. You need to sit down and discuss. But almost always, if you have the right quality dialogue, if you have the right solutions, the right compromises, there is a way forward, right? So we have a just transition center here, where of course we are finding a smooth way out for the workforce that is unlikely to continue with us in the new business because maybe they are at a certain age or whatever. And of course, you try to find the least resistance path for them to the next phase of their lives. But of course, there's this whole next generation that could play a big role in what's happening in the energy transition. And so we set up skilling centers, upskilling centers, and we work with the youth in this area and say, look, just because the industry that your parents worked in is disappearing doesn't mean you have no prospects, but you got to upskill them for that. And a lot of it has got to do with upskilling and bringing them along.
Super. So, and I think it's important. We need to cover the different parts of sustainability, and we need to cover the different parts of the world as well. And you are well placed to take us on a little bit of a journey. So far we talked about Europe. There's a bit more to talk about on the grid, etc. But share with us a little bit your perspective on China and India. We don't need to talk about the US so much now, but I think just your perspective on China as an engine for developing renewables products at scale, India in a huge transition. Share with us a little bit your perspectives, please.
Yeah, I think China is an interesting one because, I mean, first of all, it has got the scale, but also what is necessary for the energy transition very much, and which is what we are missing in Europe, is a stable regulatory framework. And you have seen, I was thinking about it this morning as I was driving to the office, that it happens that energy transition comes also at a time in Europe when there is a lot of political turmoil. And then I was thinking, am I getting the causality wrong? Isn't that the political turmoil might be caused by too much energy transition going too fast? So wasn't able to answer that for myself. But at least I realized that in China, you have some of these preconditions for a transformation like that, which means there will be pain in the short term, and you need a fiscal environment, regulatory environment that helps investors and societies go through that pain. I think that's where China has a huge advantage. And again, as I said, what we are rediscovering in US right now through the AI growth was always true in China. Energy demand was always growing in China over the last decades, and they figured it out early on that for them, energy transition is energy addition. So while they are building the largest amount of renewables in any technology in any given year, they're also building a coal plant every week. And the number of gas plants are also going up. So when I worked for my previous employer, the biggest gas turbine market before US took off like the way it did in the last months was always China. So I think in a way they find themselves in this sort of position where they don't have to choose between which technology. They will just deploy whatever is necessary. And at the same time, what China was able to benefit from was not only the deployment of the technologies, but also the development of the supply chain around it. And therefore, they were playing in so many interesting value pools that it was hard for them. They probably still have green premium, but it is offset by the gains that they make in different parts of the supply chain, something that in Europe we are not able to reinvigorate because the OEM manufacturing, component manufacturing was over time outsourced, simply because we thought that energy would always remain a commodity and we would be able to buy equipment cheap from China or wherever. So that's where China has this sort of huge advantage. And I see this continuing. And in fact, to the point where their OEMs now become so confident, so high quality that they could start to then move into Europe once again with wind technology, hydrogen, etc. So that's where China is, in my opinion. It's a very hard comparison to make.
Yeah, and moving very fast, of course. India, how about that? How do you read the energy transition with the lens of India? How fast is it going?
India,
That's it.
India is an interesting one. I think people underestimate, because the absolute size of India is so big. People underestimate the per capita numbers in that country. So India is 1.4 billion people, the most populous country on the planet right now, even more than China. And if you compare it with the total energy supply that is installed in that country, the numbers are actually quite abysmal. So China has about 3,000 gigawatts installed capacity. Out of that, 1,500 gigawatt base load and about 1,200, 1,300 gigawatt renewables. India has about 500 gigawatts total compared to the 3,000 of China for the same population. And out of that, the base load is somewhere around maybe 350, 400 gigawatts and another 100 gigawatts of photovoltaic, right? So if you look at India, I think it's just energy deficient quite significantly at the moment on a per capita basis. But at the same time, because the population is so large, its CO2 impact is already felt even at this scale. And India is also now caught in a very interesting paradox where there's a lot of urbanization happening, but because I can't say for sure because I don't have scientific evidence, but it feels every time I go back to India that it's getting warmer and warmer. Could also be because of urban centers getting more populated, and therefore there's a need for more air conditioning now. And that puts you in this negative loop where there is more warming, and then the more warming you need, the more air conditioning, and then I think that's the challenge. Having said that, India has a lot of potential for solar. The western part of India, particularly, there's a lot of sort of solar that can be built quite cheaply, quite effectively. And then there is some potential also for other technologies like onshore wind, offshore wind. There's a fair bit of hydro. It's unlikely to be able to grow like in most parts. Therefore, I think the technology that could be a game changer for India could be storage. If India is able to crack somehow cheaper storage, then the solar can really start to play into the base load, because other than that, India is still heavily dependent on coal. Almost 65 to 70% of the electricity produced is still with coal, and gas is mostly imported. And the LNG prices, as we see longer term, we expect the LNG prices to become more expensive, and therefore India will have to stay with coal a little bit longer. In all the net zero transition models that I've seen, and I've worked with some economists to understand if the world does get to net zero 2050, 2060, what are the GDP caps on some of the countries around the world? And the GDP per capita cap on India, if it has to go through a net zero system with the current cost trajectories, comes somewhere close to around $10,000 per capita in 2050, which would be lower than where China is today, right? And we are talking 25 more years, right? So inflation adjusted, that would mean practically no growth in that country. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of these sort of challenges with India. The other thing is, as I said, also about the passenger cars. If you talk about Europe, there are about 600 to 700 cars per 1,000 people. US, that number is almost 1,000 for 1,000. In a country like India, that number is still barely scratching 3 digits. So maybe 100, 150, 200 cars per 1,000 people. So again, either they do the leapfrogging like they did in the mobile era, moving from no communication to mobile communication. But if they have to go through the fossil, I think it's going to be challenging for the transition as well. And by the way, the market prices don't pay up because a lot of electricity in India is still subsidized. It's quite cheap. So if you want, and the banks are not able to provide all the lending that is needed to build that infrastructure. And therefore, of course, the challenge is if you want foreign direct investment, you have to let loose the markets. But the moment you let loose the markets, the price of electricity starts moving up, which again, for a developing country at that scale, may not be helpful.
Thank you, Kunal. You took us on a trip around the world. Now let's travel in time for closing up this podcast, and let's look ahead in the future. You talked a little bit about looking into the future, net zero 2050. For that vision to hold, the next years are make or break. They're pretty decisive. What do you think are the decisions in that window that will really shape our future? What role do you think Europe can play? We touched upon India, China, and maybe let's close on what's one thing about working in this field that still gives you energy.
Yeah, so first of all, if you've been in the energy industry for as long as I have been, you can only be optimistic, right? Because energy transition always moves 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. So there are years where you could say were very difficult years for the transition, and then there are years where you say things really, really move forward. What's happening is more and more people are understanding the fundamental reason why we should price the planet in. Those who have kids, they need no convincing at all why we should think beyond our own lifetime. But in general, people are starting to understand, right? Second is the transition has gotten to a critical scale where people realize that this is serious business and it can be achieved, right? So earlier there was a lot of piloting and there was a lot of theoretical debate around what can it really do. But now when you see the electricity sector in Europe, which for me is the torchbearer of the scaling that we are seeing, so there's a sort of lot of proof points now where if you were on the edge, you are more likely to start believing in transition than not. Are there any make or break decisions? I don't think so. I mean, the governments have to do what they have to do to secure the defenses of the country. For example, if this is the year where we think more about the defense in Europe, about thinking about funding the NATO, I mean, so be it, right? The transition is flexible enough to then sort of slow down for a while. Every time there's pressure on transition, what it does is it high grades the technologies that are more economic than the others. So the earlier discussion we had, maybe it's an easier decision to push some very expensive technologies to the back end and focus on where we can get the most impact, right? So I think there are no single make or break decisions. I think the transition is, again, directionally it is set. The pace will change sooner or later. And I think also as maybe it's really now talking about the future, but I have much more faith in the future generations who are not held back by certain beliefs, who have not seen wealth only in the hands of certain industrialized companies which worked in a certain way, who now believe that you could create wealth in many different ways while not sort of sacrificing the planet. So I think that gives me a lot of hope that as we will start to pass the mantle to the next generation, there will be these tipping points where the transition would sort of start to move faster. I have a lot of faith in AI as well. I think there's a lot of technological breakthroughs we are not able to reach today that AI might help us to reach as well. So I think that could be another positive impulse for the transition. What motivates me? Well, as you said, I chose my path towards transition not because one thing led to another, but at some point I also made very conscious choices. I am very happy to see that my role, which was in previous companies, more sort of innovation, and is now a very core role where I'm in a company which is a significant company, and we can put 95% of our billions of dollars in an area where I totally believe in. So I think I can't think of anyone else who has a better job.
You're in the making it happen role.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kunal. You are truly inside the transition, and it was a pleasure to talk to you today.
And thank you, Kunal, again. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to the next time we speak.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
That's all for this week. This podcast was proudly brought to you by the International Institute for Management Development in Lausanne. You can find out more at imd.org.